Welcome back to Study Buddy. Today on Python programming, we are going to be making some simple programs because today we're going to learn about some pretty fun and basic things, which are variables, user input, and string concatenation. But make sure to check the description for some helpful timestamps that'll help guide you through this video. And let's start off this lesson by opening up our idle. I apologize if you can hear my clicks in the background, but it is just impossible to program without a mouse. Okay, so first off, let's just start off this lesson by introducing some shortcuts that'll help save you a lot of time when it comes to learning how to program. First things first is opening up a brand new file. Normally you have to go up to File and click on New File. But instead of doing that, you can hit Control-N or Command-N and it'll open up a brand new file for you. That's the shortcut for opening up a brand new file. And now that we have our file open here, we are going to try to do the shortcut to save a file. So to save a file, instead of going up to File and clicking on Save, you can instead hit Control-S or Command-S and it'll save the program for you. So because this is the first time we're saving this program, it's asking like, what do we want to name it? I'll name this program Bananas. Normally you're supposed to name your program something that's like important, but I haven't even made a program yet, so just name it whatever. And now, the final shortcut I'm going to show you is how to run a program. So normally, you can go up to the top, click on Run, and click on Run Module to run your program. But instead of doing that, you can hit F5, or you need to hold the FN key on your keyboard and then hit F5. And that'll just run the program for you. But yeah, those are the shortcuts that work in almost any programming application. Now let's move on to variables. Variables is where programming begins to get a little interesting. Variables are probably something you've seen in your math class if you've taken algebra or something of that kind. But if you haven't heard or seen of a variable before, don't worry. Variables are essentially how you store data, but do not worry about the definition. Normally, in a math class, you have some letter, and you set that letter, this is our variable in this instance, and you set that variable, in this case x, to equal some sort of value. So for example, 3. So essentially we are storing this value 3, into the variable x. Or in programming terms, we are assigning the value of 3 to the variable x. And essentially what we're saying here is we're going to use x for a placeholder for 3 in this instance. So for example, if I wanted to do x plus 2, this would in reality be 3 plus 2 because x is equal to 3, so therefore you could just replace this x with a 3 because x is equal to 3. And this would result in the number 5, or the integer 5, if you want to use some fun vocab there. But you may think like, that's kind of boring, what's the point of learning this in programming, right? But this is where programming gets a little interesting. So how variables work within programming is it's not simply just you have one letter and you set that one letter to equal some number, whether it be an integer or a float. You can name your variables whatever you want, and you can set those variables to equal whatever value you want. So what I mean by that is something like this. For example, instead of having this variable x to equal 3, I can have this variable x be equal to a string. So for example, I could write hello world inside of this variable. And then if I wanted to, for instance, print hello world, I can, instead of just printing hello world, instead of quotation marks, I can instead say print x, because x is equal to the string hello world, which means x is kind of like a placeholder, so this is essentially saying print hello world. To give an example that this works, let's save this program, so Control-Command-S, and run this program, so F5 or FN and F5, and as you can see, it prints out hello world. Pretty snazzy, right? Now, you can also use other data types and store those data types into variables. So for example, I could get a boolean, or a true or false value, and set that variable to equal the variable x. And now I can just keep this x here, doesn't really matter. Let's save this program with Control-Command-S and run it with F5. As you can see, it prints out true, and here's our prompt, which means we're at the end of the program. So that's pretty cool. You can set your variables to equal whatever you want. Now, as I said before earlier, you can also name your variables whatever you want. For example, I can name my variable this jumble of letters here. And if I copy and paste that in to this print function, and I save it with Control-Command-S and run it with F5, it still works, because instead of having the variable x be your placeholder for the value of true, in this case, we have this jumble of letters instead. And it works exactly the same. But before you get off on the track of naming your variables like random things, it's really important to name your variables things that are relevant to the data that they hold. So for instance, let's say I want to print out a menu. I want to say that one pizza is priced at $9.99. So I'd probably have some variable equal to $9.99. But I could technically just write my whole program, and whenever I refer to this variable x in this instance, I could just say, oh, this x is actually the pizza price. And that would totally make sense to me because I'm the one making the program. But when other people are reading your program, they're probably going to read X, what does that mean, right? So just to avoid confusion, we just name our variables things that are relevant to the data they're holding. So if I wanted this variable to relate to the price of a pizza, I'd probably say this variable is called pizza price. And when we're naming variables in programming, we never use spaces because that just kind of breaks the whole program. We normally identify that there's a space by using a capital, or we use an underscore. But in Python and other programming languages, it's very common to use a capital letter to define a space. So as you can see, we have pizza price. I could technically even just shorthand this to price if I wanted. So we know how to use a variable now, or not necessarily how to use it, but we know what it can do. We can essentially set some value or assign some value to equal some variable name, and then we can refer to that variable name later in our program. So that's pretty cool. But now let's kind of put this variable information off to the side, and let's talk about user input. User input is essentially how we get information from the user. That's a pretty broad term. And don't worry about the definition, worry about how to actually use it. So what I mean by that is, for example, if your math teacher asked you what is 1 plus 2, you'd most likely respond with the number 3. That is an example of user input. We can essentially do the same thing in programming. And the way we do that is through the input function. So remember, a function is just a word and then a pair of parentheses. So inside of this input function is normally where you put the question that you, the program in this instance, are trying to ask the user. So how about, let's try to make a program that asks the user for their name. And how about, let's also have it greet them. So like prints like hello and then like the name. So this is going to be our goal. If we want to ask the user, what is your name? Well, that's kind of it, right? You put what is your name into the input function. So inside of our quotation marks, because the input function takes strings for input, ironic, right? We will put probably like, what is your name? And then you're probably going to want to put a space after your question, but inside the string, for a reason I'll explain later. And how about, let's try and save and run this program, which remember is Control-Command-S, and then F5. And as you can see, we have what is your name, and as you can see, there's a space here. So if there were no space, our cursor would be right here in front of the question mark, which is very ugly to most people. So how about I'll just say like my name's like Gilbert or something. And whoa, there's the prompt. That's the end of our program. Here's where things get interesting. As I said before, variables can be named whatever you want and store whatever information you want. So what we can do with this input function and with our knowledge of variables is we can set the output of this input function to equal a variable, or we can store the information the user is giving us into a variable, which we can use later inside of the program. So how would we do that? First, we need to set this equal to a variable, but even before that, we need to think, what are we going to name our variable? And because we want to name our variable something that is relevant to the data it holds, I think maybe like username would be a good variable name. So username. And again, we do not use spaces when defining variables. We use an underscore or a capital letter to define where a space would be. So, as you can see, we are assigning the input to the question, what is your name, to the variable username. Now, our second part of our to-do list is to print hello, and then the name of the user. Let's just not worry about printing the hello. Let's just try and print the user's name. So let's put our print function, and inside of this print function, we'll just put in our variable. Do note that this variable is not in quotation marks, because if this variable is in quotation marks, that's not a variable, but a string. And let me give an example of that right now. So as you can see, we have username, not in quotation marks, so let's save and run this program. So what is your name? Let's just say Bob. Prints out Bob. So now let's try to put username instead of quotation marks. And let's see what'll happen. So let's save this program and run it. And what is your name? Let's just say Hubert. And it prints out username. So there you go. It sees the username instead of quotation marks as a string and not a variable. There's a myth busted right there. So now we know how to grab the user input and use it in a program. Now let's try to make this program user-friendly. So this is pretty primitive right now still, but let's try to just have the program say hello name. What a lot of people would likely try to do is probably like hello, and then they'd like close it here, but then you just kind of run into an issue, right? This username is a variable, and this hello here is a string. So how do you attach those two together so I can just say like hello username, right? This is where string concatenation comes in. So I'm going to comment these out for a quick second. We will come back to this in a moment. Let's talk about string concatenation. I'm probably going to spell this wrong, so don't take my word on my spelling. String concatenation is essentially how you get multiple data types and piece them all together into a string. So for example, if I had a string and a variable, I can piece those two data types together to form a brand new string. Or if I had an integer and I had a string, I can piece those both together and make a string. That's pretty abstract, but let's give an example. So we want our program to print hello and then like the username, right? I'll put like the username inside of a parentheses to help show like this is a variable. So the main way that we can attach strings together to create a new string is using plus signs. So how that works is, for example, putting that concatenated string and assigning it to be the value of a variable. Let's have a variable called prompt in this case. Don't worry about the variable name right now. This is just for example purposes. And what we essentially want is the string hello attached to our variable username. So how we would do that is we'd put our string hello, and then we put a plus sign, and then we put username, or whatever variable you're using, and then we put another plus sign, and then inside of a string, we put an exclamation mark. Now, we have to go back into our entire string and add spaces into the smaller strings where it's appropriate. So what I mean by that is there is a space in between hello and the variable username. So in the string hello, I need to put a space there. And there is no space in between the variable and the exclamation mark, so we can just leave that alone. So now I can print out prompt, and this program should work. So let me just grab this line of code from up here, paste that down here. Actually, let me just delete all of this up here. Let's try out this program. So let's save it with Control-Command-S and run it with F5. What is your name? Let's go with Larry. And it prints out, hello Larry. Isn't that great? So now that we know that we can concatenate strings and chuck it into a variable, another way that you can print out a concatenated string is simply by printing out a concatenated string. So instead of assigning this string into a variable and then printing out that variable, you can just print it directly by just placing the whole concatenated string inside of the print function or whatever function, for instance, right? So let's save and run this program. So what is your name? Let's just say Joe. And as you can see, it works exactly the same. So in that case, it's ultimately your preference whether you want to get your concatenated string, chuck it into a variable, or just use your concatenated string as is. It generally does not make a difference, and it's pretty much just kind of like your preference, your style of how you like to code. So don't worry that you're programming wrong, because there's no right way to program. Alright, but that's going to be it for today's episode. Hopefully it'll be shorter than the last one. Things are going to get a lot more interesting with programming, so stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe if you enjoyed this lesson. Leave a like, leave a comment, share it, do whatever, right? And I will see you in the next lesson.